Good morning, everyone. I believe it's Wednesday, and today's the day when I have moved my reading outside. It's a beautiful day. We have a woods behind us, which will give us the feeling that our new book is moving into the forest. Maybe we'll hear some outside noises. Did everybody do a picture? I did. Here was my picture of my favorite part. It was when the two mice climbed into the Dr. Pepper bottle and rolled down the pile of trash to get away from the cats. I don't know what you drew. If you didn't have time to draw, at least I hope you just closed your eyes and visualized for a little bit. I remember that the last thing we read at the end of our ragweed book was, can a tiny deer mouse outwit her biggest enemy? Read Poppy, the second of the Poppy stories, and find out. So we're going to read another book, and sounds like we have a new mouse, Poppy. Who was the enemies in this book? Graybar and Silversides. They were the enemies against Clutch and Ragweed and Blinker. But Poppy, who was going to be out in the forest, and we have a new map which shows the forest. It talks about nest and different trees and a marsh and a bridge and just all different kinds of things that we're going to run into in our second book. So let's begin Poppy. Chapter 1, Mr. Okax. Now, if you look at this name, Mr. Okax, it's kind of a hard one to pronounce, and one thing I've always told my friends when they're reading a chapter book and they come to someone's name and they don't know how to pronounce it, or if you're doing a star reading quiz, don't take a lot of time to figure out what that proper noun is. We could call him Mr. O while we were reading the rest of the book if we never figured out what his name was, but I'm going to attempt to call him Mr. Okax. A thin crescent moon high in the sky shed faint white light over Dimwood Forest. Stars glowed. Breezes full of ripe summer fragrance floated over nearby meadow and hill. Dimwood itself, veiled in darkness, lay utterly still. At the very edge of this forest stood an old charred oak, on which sat a great horned owl. The owl's name was Mr. Okax, and he looked like death himself. Mr. Okax's eyes, flat upon his face, were round and yellow with large ebony pupils that enabled him to see as few other creatures could. Moonlight, even faint moonlight, was as good as daylight for him. With his piercing gaze, Mr. Okax surveyed the lands he called his own, watching for the comings and goings of the creatures he considered his subjects and his dinners. He looked at Glitter Creek, home to the fish he found so appetizing, the tar road across which tasty rabbits were known to hop, Jay's Wood, where meaty chipmunks sometimes skittered before dawn. By swiveling his head, he searched the marsh for a savory frog. Then Newfield, where usually he could count on a delicious vole or two. He looked at Gray House, where Farmer Lamont used to live, then upon the old orchard. He even looked nervously toward Newhouse, but nowhere did he see a thing to eat. Profoundly annoyed, Mr. Ocax was beginning to think he would have no dinner tonight. But finally, there, near the top of Bancock Hill, where the ponderosa pines had all been cut, where only a few struggling saplings and bushes grew, he saw movement. Just the glimmer of food was enough to cause his owl's heart to pound, his curved black beak to clack, his feathered horns to stand up tall. Mr. Ocax shifted his head from left to right, forward and back. When he did so, he beheld 2 mice. Of all the creatures the owl hunted, he enjoyed mice the most. They were the best eating, to be sure. But better still, they were the most fearful, and Mr. Ocax found deep satisfaction in having others afraid of him. And here, after a wait of nearly the whole night, were 2 savory subjects to terrify before he ate them. One of the 2, a deer mouse, crouched cautiously beneath a length of rotten bark. The other, a golden mouse, stood in the opening on his hind legs, his short tail sticking straight out behind for balance. From his left ear, an earring dangled. In his paws, he held a hazelnut. Do you know who the one mouse is? I'm not going to tell you. We'll go on and read. It's not as if I haven't warned these mice, Mr. Ocax murmured to himself. If they will move about without my permission, they will only have themselves to blame for the consequences. As he leaned forward to listen, his sharpened as needle talons, 4 to each large claw, and jet black at their tips, cut deeply into the branch he was perched on. Catching these 2 mice, he mused, is going to be fun. On Bancock Hill, the golden mouse turned to his timid companion and said, "Poppy girl, this hazelnut is bad to the bone. Bet you seed to sap there's more where it came from. Come on out and dig." Ragweed Poppy replied as she sniffed tensely in all directions. You promised we'd dance when we got here. We can't do it in the open. Besides, I want to answer your question. So will you please get under here with me? Ragweed laughed. Dude, you must think I'm as dull as a dormouse. You just want to get some of this nut. I don't want any of your precious nut, Poppy insisted. I want to give you my answer, and I want to dance. Isn't that the reason we came up the hill? Only it's not safe out there. Oh, tell me about it. You heard my father's warnings, Poppy went on. It's Mr. Ocax. He might be watching and listening. Get off, Ragweed sneered. Your pop talks about that Ocax dude just to scare you and keep you under control. Ragweed, Poppy cried. That's ridiculous. Mr. Oacax does rule Dimwood, so we have to ask his permission to be here. And you know perfectly well we never did. Dude, I'm not going to spend my life asking an old owl's okay every time I want to have fun. Know what I'm saying? This is our moment, girl, right? And now that I've dug this nut up, I'm going to enjoy it. Besides, he said, it's too dark for an old owl to see me. Poppy, Mr. Oacax scuffed under his breath. Ragweed, what stupid names mice have. Now, if only that deer mouse will move just a little further out from under cover, I'll be able to snare both mice at once. The mere thought of such a double catch made Mr. Oacax hiss with pleasure. Then he clacked his beak, spread his wings, and rose into the night air. Up he circled, his fluted flight feathers beating the air silently. High above Bangkok Hill, he looked down. The golden mouse, the one eating the nut, was still in the open. So brazen, so foolish. Nevertheless, Mr. Oacax decided to hold back another moment to see if the deer mouse might budge. Ragweed, Poppy pleaded, please get under here. Girl, Ragweed said, do you know what your problem is? You let your tail lead the way. Poppy, hurt and wanting to show she was not a coward, poked her nose and whiskers out from under the bark. Ragweed, she had persisted even as she began to creep into the open. Being careless is stupid. Her friend took another scrape of the nut and sighed with pleasure. Poppy, he said, you may be my best girl, but admit it, you don't know how to live like I do. Poppy took 2 more steps beyond the bark. Just then, Mr. Oacax pulled his wings close to his body and plunged. In an instant, he was right above and behind the 2 mice. Once there, he threw out his wings to break his speed, pulled back his head to protect his eyes, and thrust his claws forward and wide like grappling hooks to pounce. It was Poppy who saw him. Ragweed, she shrieked in terror as she hurled herself back under cover. It's Oacax. But the owl was already upon them. Down came his right claw. It scratched the tip of Poppy's nose. Down came his left claw. It was more successful, clamping around Ragweed's head and neck like a vise of needles, killing him instantly. The next moment, the owl soared back into the air. A lifeless ragweed earring, glittering in the moonlight, hung from a claw. As for the hazelnut, it fell to the earth like a cold stone. Here is the owl plunging down and getting ragweed. Powerful but leisurely strokes brought Mr. Oacax back to his watching tree. Once there, he shifted the dead ragweed from talon to beak in one gulp. The mouse disappeared down his throat, earring and all. His hunger momentarily satisfied, Mr. Oacax tilted back his head and let forth a long, low cry of triumph. Whoo! Whoo! Poppy did not hear the call. In her terror, she had fainted. Now she lay unconscious beneath the length of rotten bark. The owl did not mind. He had enjoyed the first mouse so much he decided to wait for the second. Indeed, Mr. Oacax was not entirely sorry that Poppy had escaped. She was terrified, and he enjoyed that. As for sure, he would get her soon. Oh, yes, he murmured to himself. Mice are the most fun to catch. Then Mr. Oacax did that rare thing for an owl. He smiled. Okay, I'm going to take a minute to stop between chapter 1 and 2 and tell you a story that we had at Crestview. And this was before most of you were going to school at Crestview. It was several years ago, and we had read the story, and the children knew that Ragweed had been eaten by the owl and then spit out, they thought. So they were walking along the road on their way to the library, and their teacher found a little dead mouse at the side of the road. And she said, "Look, boys and girls, I have found Ragweed. We're going to take him back to Crestview, and we're going to give him a ceremony and have a funeral for Crestview." And nobody at school told me about it, but they had called my husband to come to school to do the service. And I was sitting in class, and a couple of kids came running in. Miss Polly, you need to come outside quick. You need to come out by the pond." And I thought, out by the pond? That's strange. But I followed their directions and went out to the pond. And when I looked out by the pond, there were just a ton of kids standing around the pond. And I looked, and I saw our principal, and he was holding my 1-year-old granddaughter. And I thought, well, that's strange. Why is he holding my granddaughter? And then I looked over closer to the pond, and my husband was standing there. And he had on a nice dress coat and was holding a Bible in his hands. And so I just stood there and watched what was going on. And my husband performed a very serious funeral for Ragweed, and the children watched, and they had buried a hole by the pond, and they laid Ragweed to rest, and the children were crying. And it was a very sad ceremony, but yet kids would talk about it for years and years, that as they would read the book, that Ragweed is buried by the pond. So that was just a little story and connection that I wanted to tell you about that we did at Crestview for our friend Ragweed. So now we're going to go on to chapter 2. And before we start, we're going to talk a little bit again about our main character. And at this point, it sounds like Poppy is going to be our main character, since she's on the front cover. And our setting has changed. We're not in the city anymore. Listen, can you hear the birds? We're in the woods now. So we're outside and we're going to see creeks and trees, and the enemy in our book, or the bad guy, it sounds like, is going to be Mr. Oacax instead of the cats. Poor little mice, they've always got somebody to look out for, don't they? Chapter 2. It's called Poppy Remembers. A stinging sensation on her nose woke Poppy. She touched a paw to the sore spot and winced. Then she looked about in the dark and shook her head with confusion. Where was she? Under a piece of rotten bark. Where was the bark? On Bangkok Hill. What was she doing there? She had come with her boyfriend, Ragweed. Where was Ragweed? No sooner did Poppy ask herself that she was full horror of what had occurred rushed upon her. Ragweed was dead, eaten probably. Poppy closed her eyes. The sheer ghastliness of the thought made it hard for her to breathe. Then, recalling how close she had come to the same fate, she checked herself for other injuries. Through her plump round belly was white. The rest of her fur was orange-brown. She had large ears and dark, almost round eyes, full whiskers, tiny nose, pink toes, and tail. Even for a deer mouse, Poppy was rather dainty. Upon examining everything, except the nose, seemed to be intact. She stole a look out from under the bark and considered her situation. She was on Bangkok Hill alone and without permission. Oh, how she wished she were home. From her earliest days, just a few moons ago, her parents had been teaching their litter about Mr. Oacax. She recalled how they had lined up, all 12 of them, to take instruction. Mr. Oacax has been about for ages, her father, Lungwort, lectured in his sternest voice. He was a rather stout fellow with elegantly curled whiskers and slightly protruding front teeth. His crowning glory was an ivory thimble he had found, and which ever since he'd worn as a cap. Mr. Oacax has been here longer than any mouse's living memory, Lungwort continued. The territory around Dimwood belongs to him. Mr. Oacax is king. And he protects us, said sweet Cecilia Lee, Lungwort's wife and Poppy's mother. That's the most important thing. Sweet Cecilia was a small creature, even for a deer mouse, with soft, pale eyes and a nervous habit of flickering at her ears with her paws as if they were dusty. Protects us from what? Poppy remembered Ragweed asking. An outsider he had taken to hanging around the family. He was always asking for answers. Why do deer mice live here and not there? Why do folks eat this and not that? Why is your fur dark on top and white on the bottom when mine is golden? Why couldn't it be the other way around? Though these constant questions could be irritating, Poppy had to admit that she'd often wondered about the answers. Curiosity, however, was not something her parents encouraged. Poppy admired Ragweed's persistence. Mr. Ocax protects us from creatures that eat us, Lungwort answered gravely. Raccoons, foxes, skunks, weasels, stoats. One by one, he displayed pictures of these animals. Most important, he protects us from porcupines, like this one. He held up a lurid portrait of a huge black-nosed beast covered with gruesome spikes. Blood seemed to drip from his snarling mouth. The young mice gasped in dread. Porcupines are our particular enemies, Lungwort insisted. There is nothing porcupines won't do to catch mice. What would they do with us then? Acorn, one of Poppy's sisters, asked in a trembling voice. First, they'd shoot their barbed quills into you, Lungwort said. Then they trample you, Sweet Cecilia added. Finally, Lungwort concluded, they break you into little bits and gobble you up. Now it was terror the young mice felt, all except Ragweed. Lungwort, he demanded, other than that picture, you ever seen a porcupine? A real one? Not precisely, Lungwort snapped, but let me tell you something, Ragweed. I'd be more than thrilled to get through my whole life without ever seeing one. After all, Mr. Ocax has seen porcupines often. In private conversations with me, mind, these are actual, personal experiences I can verify. He informed me that porcupines are not only extremely dangerous, but also devilishly sly. Take note that this judgment comes from a powerful, meat-eating bird. The point is, Mr. Ocax protects us from porcupines. It was he, in fact, who was kind enough to educate us about them as well as supply these pictures. Then how come you have to worry about this dude Ocax too? Ragweed pressed. Struggling to control his temper, Lungwort tapped his thimble cap down over his forehead. Fuming, he replied, Mr. Ocax protects us from vicious porcupines only when we accept him as our ruler. That's why. All he requires is that we ask his permission whenever we move beyond the immediate area of Grey House. We have freedom to go about the old orchard up to Glitter Creek. We can do the same for Farmer Lamont's fields, at our own risk, of course. Life is full of danger. Go beyond, however, and we need to get Mr. Ocax's permission. What's this reason? Ragweed persevered. Sweet Cecilia, brushing her ears, sighed with exasperation. How Poppy, her own daughter, could take up with such an ill-mannered ruffian was beyond her understanding. All the same, she said, Ragweed, as Mr. Ocax has patiently explained to my husband, he needs to know if we're moving about so he won't mistake us for porcupines. Asking permission is a small sacrifice to pay for our own safety. Lungwort nodded his agreement. That owl, he pointed out, has incredible vision and hearing. He can hear or see anything, even in the dark. And a good thing, too, porcupines prowl at night. Move like lightning, Mr. Okax says. Shoot quills without asking questions. Kill without mercy. Oh, my boy, we don't argue with Mr. Okax. He's our protector. If we disobey him, break his rules, and I can't say I blame him either, he gets upset. What he'll do then? Asked Leaf, one of Poppy's brothers. He'll eat you, Lungworth replied briskly as he put away the pictures of the porcupine. And, he continued, it happens. During the past year, we have lost some 15 family members. It may be presumed that all failed to ask Mr. Okax for permission to go somewhere. The children were shocked into silence. Ragweed, however, spoke out again. Hey, Pops, didn't I hear you say porcupines are huge? You saw the picture, Lugwort responded. And don't call me Pops, it's common. So then porcupines are bigger than us, right? A lot bigger, Sweet Cecilia said, emphasizing the lot. Well, old lady, Ragweed kept on, if their porcupines are so huge and we're so small, and if this dude Al has such amazing sight, how come he might confuse us mice with them there dude porcupines? Know what I'm saying? An indignant Sweet Cecilia looked to her husband. Lugwort sputtered. Ragweed, for your information, proper grammar usage is those porcupines, not them there porcupines. And while I'm thinking about it, if you intend to court my daughter, I'll thank you to groom your hair properly when you get up in the morning. As for that earring you've taken to wearing, I don't like it, not one bit. This family is committed to keeping up mice values, and it is opposed to stupid questions. With that, Lugwort stalked away, tail whipping about in agitation. Oh, I got a word. I'm having trouble with boys and girls. He's mad. That's what it means. He's mad. On Bangkok Hill, Poppy remembered it all. She also remembered it was Ragweed who insisted they come up the hill, but that he absolutely refused to ask Mr. Okax's permission to do so. Perhaps then what occurred, horrible as it had been, had served Ragweed right. Then and there, Poppy vowed she would never leave home again. The difficulty was that at that moment she was far from home, frightened and alone. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today. Poppy's alone and she's scared, and you have to make predictions about, will she get home? Will she get swallowed by Mr. Okax? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.